You may begin.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service, we welcome all of you to the first webinar of a 10-part export compliance series during this week, which is Export Week 2023. Today's webinar is titled An Introduction to the Bureau of Industry and Security and Export Basics. Going over just a slight schedule of not only this week, but of all of the entire 10-part series. You'll see the first 3 sessions will take place this week. We'll cover down, of course, on an intro of BIS and export basics. Get your pads and pens ready. Then we'll move tomorrow to complying with ITAR. Those who are not ITAR regulated or understand that they are not, you will be if you have any interest. In those that are, this is going to be a nice, healthy refresher. Then we're going to cover down on OFAC, or the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, for Wednesday. And then kicking off or starting the next week, we'll go through license exceptions, then followed by deemed exports. And you can understand why we want to help you with developing a corporate export management and compliance program. We'll have special agents or a special agent from the export office or enforcement officer speak with us as well. Site visits and enforcement actions, as you can see. Then another one that a lot of folks should know, if you're exporting or not, is export controls at trade shows, then Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And then finally, we're going to do a recap. So get your questions in. If you don't get them in now, send them to me, brian.beams@trade.gov, on any of the upcoming sessions, so we could answer those questions during our presentation. And that session is going to be Ask a Compliance Professional. Before we get going today, I just want to cover down on some housekeeping items. Everyone is currently on listen-only mode. This session will be recorded. If you disagree, please disconnect at this time. Participants can write in their questions into the Q&A feature at any time throughout this presentation. Next week, just hello everyone, right? Next week, attention, we will send out the week's recordings with the resource materials, i.e. presentations, slide decks, so on and so forth. At the end of the 10 weeks, so the first week of June, we will cover down or send out a master email again with all the recordings and resource materials of all 10 sessions. Lastly, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation may not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government. I now welcome in Tahlia Townsend, a partner at Wiggin, and Dana. She is our subject matter expert. Tahlia?
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tahlia Townsend, and I am the co-chair of the International Trade Compliance Practice at a law firm called Wiggin and Dana. That's a law firm in Washington, D.C., New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Florida, so up and down the East Coast. I've been doing this for a long time. My daily practice involves advising large companies, small companies, international companies, US companies, foreign companies on how to comply with US export controls, including the EAR, which we're going to talk about today, the ITAR, the Office of Foreign Assets Control Sanctions, and a little thing called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So that's something I do with my team all day, every day, and I am delighted to share some of that experience with you today in performing this training. So with that, let's get going. We've got quite a lot to cover here. So we're going to start today talking about the Bureau of Industry and Security, an introduction to US export controls, in particular the Export Administration Regulations. So what is the Bureau of Industry and Security? For those of you who haven't heard about it before, this is an office within the Department of Commerce, and they are charged with protecting the security of the United States. That includes national security. It also includes economic security, cybersecurity, and homeland security. So one of the ways that BIS, we pronounce it BIS, one of the ways that they protect national security is by enforcing the Export Administration Regulations, abbreviated as EAR, looks like ear, but we pronounce it EAR. So the EAR regulations, these can be found at 15 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 730 following. That's what that little citation there indicates. If you're interested, you can read the whole thing yourselves from beginning to end. If you print it out, it's about this big, so set aside some time to do that. So the BIS administers the EAR, and the EAR are intended to regulate exports, meaning from the United States, re-exports. For those of you who are joining us from overseas, a re-export is when you move something that was received from the United States to another foreign country. So it goes from the US to France, and then from France to Germany, or from France to Brazil, for example. But also in-country transfers. So an item is exported from the United States to Germany, and then in Germany, there's a change of end user or end use. That would be an in-country transfer. All of those are regulated activities under the EAR. Now, the EAR regulates primarily commercial and dual-use items, but it also regulates some less sensitive military items. This can be surprising to people, but it is the case that in the US, many military items are regulated under the ITAR, which we'll talk about in a second, but some less sensitive items are in fact in the domain of the EAR and therefore under the authority of the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. In addition to regulating exports and re-exports and transfers of items, the Bureau of Industry and Security, the EA, and its regulations, the EAR, also regulate and impose controls on what US persons can do, even when they don't involve any regulated items. So for example, US persons are not allowed to provide services to certain categories of parties or in support of certain kinds of end uses. We'll talk about that more in a few moments. Now, the EAR are not the only body of export regulations in the US. Many of you will also have heard of the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which Brian referenced earlier. That's administered by the Department of State. And the ITAR is the body of regulations that governs exports of much more sensitive, the most sensitive military items. As I said, less sensitive military items are under the EAR, more sensitive under the ITAR. In addition, the Office of Foreign Assets Controls has something to say about international transactions. And so you need to think about those if you're performing any kind of international activity. There are also a couple of sets of regulations that are focused on items that can be used in connection with either nuclear explosive activities or nuclear energy activities. Those are administered by the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Most of you won't have to worry about those, but they do exist. And in some cases, if items are sold by the US government to another foreign government, not through a commercial sale, but through the Foreign Military Sales Program, then a separate set of regulations applies. But for most of you, the big question is always going to be, do I need to comply with the EAR, which is what we're talking about today, or the ITAR, which you will have a webinar on later in the week? Today, we're focused on the EAR, which again is for commercial items, but also less sensitive military items. Okay, so a little more detail about the EAR and why you should care. You've all made a great decision to sign up for this webinar today. That was smart because particularly with the situation in Russia and Ukraine, export controls have become more and more significant over the last few years. There has been more and more enforcement. BIS has announced a plan to enforce these regulations even more aggressively than they have in the past. So it makes sense for everybody to be paying careful attention. It's important to realize that even an unintentional violation can be a subject of an enforcement action. So even if you think you don't need authorization and you go ahead and you innocently export something without permission, that can be the topic of a civil enforcement matter. And the civil enforcements can be penalized with a penalty of over $330,000 per violation, and various other things too. You can lose your ability to do government contracting. You can be subject to audits, lots of negative consequences from violating the regs. So it makes sense to pay attention to them. And as I said, right now, there is a lot more attention by the government on everybody's compliance with these regulations because the government wants to protect national security. BIS is doing its best to do that, and they are increasing the level of enforcement. So what do you need to know about the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations? When do they apply? This is the first big question. As I said, they apply to certain kinds of activities. Exports from the United States, re-exports from one foreign country to another foreign country, and changes of end user or end use within a single foreign country. And they don't apply to all exports. They only apply to exports of items that are subject to the Export Administration Regulations. That's not all items, because some items are subject to the Department of Energy nuclear regulations or the International Traffic in Arms regulations, for example. If an item is subject to those regulations, then you must comply with the ITAR or the nuclear-related regulations, not the EAR. If an item is not subject to the ITAR or the nuclear regulations, then if it is produced in or located in or developed in the United States, it is subject to the EAR. And that applies to anything, any kind of hardware in the United States, any commodity in the United States. Even peanut butter is subject to the EAR. You can't just put it in a box and send it where you like. There are restrictions on where you can send a can of or a jar of Jiffy peanut butter. So it's important to recognize that anything that is located in the United States or developed or produced in the United States and that is not subject to the ITAR or the nuclear regs is subject to the EAR, even if you would not think of it as being a national security sensitive item. Just remember that peanut butter is subject to the EAR, right? Important to realize even less sensitive items. So items in the US, items developed or produced in the United States are subject to the EAR, and it's sticky. They stay subject to the EAR even after they've been exported, and that's where the re-exports come in. You send it to France, the French person wants to send that jar of peanut butter to Brazil, they need to comply with the EAR as well. The EAR also will attach to some foreign produced items. So you may be manufacturing something in Germany, in Mexico, in Brazil. That item, if it contains a certain amount of US origin content, or if it was derived from US technology, you sent a blueprint to Mexico and they produced the item for you in Mexico, for example, those items can be subject to the EAR. The rules are quite complicated for when foreign produced items get caught, but it is possible. And so it's important for foreign companies to be aware that things they are producing could be subject to these rules, even if they never enter the United States. All right, so you've got exports, re-exports, or transfers of items that are subject to the EAR, though that is one situation in which the EAR applies. Other situation in which the EAR applies is when there is a US person involved. Even if the US person is not sending, exporting, re-exporting, transferring an item that is subject to the EAR, that person's activities may be subject to the EAR. And this is the case when the person's activities would support certain kinds of prohibited end uses. Generally speaking, things like developing chemical and biological weapons, developing nuclear explosive devices, developing missiles in certain countries. For example, a US person couldn't work for the Israeli government developing a long-range unmanned aerial system. They would need authorization from the US government for that. All right, so that's when the EAR applies. These are the situations in which you need to think about the EAR. So focusing for a minute on US companies, the most common activity you would be doing is exporting something from the United States to a foreign customer, for example. Well, an export typically is a transmission of something. You put it in a box, you send it across the border to a foreign country. That's an export. But it's really important to understand that these regulations don't just apply to hardware, to commodities, they also apply to information. What kind of information? Technical information that is related to the development or production of controlled hardware. And also software and source code are subject to these regulations. Now, because the regulations apply to certain kinds of information, that information may be shared with a foreign person. If you send it outside the United States by email to somebody sitting in Italy, for example, that's an export of the information. It's moving from the US to Italy. But a little more confusing are deemed exports. There's a webinar on these later in the week, but just briefly for now, if I'm sitting here in the United States, my friend from Brazil comes to visit me, and I'm an engineer, and I am talking excitedly about my work, and I describe the blueprints for some fancy new product that I'm making. That person has the brain of a Brazilian citizen. And when I share the information with them, even if it happens in Connecticut, that is considered to be an export to their country of citizenship, to Brazil. So if somebody has multiple citizenships, you consider them most recent under the EAR. But the important thing to be aware of is that when you share technical information with a person in the United States, that is also an export regulated activity. Okay. So we've talked about when BIS's rules, the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, can apply. Now, what if you know that you're subject to the EAR And you need to make a decision about what authorization allows you to send this item out of the country or allows you to share the source code or the technical information with a foreign visitor in the United States. You need to determine what kind of authorization allows you to do that. If an item is subject to the EAR, you must have some kind of authorization to send it out of the country. Even something that isn't sensitive like peanut butter, you need some kind of authorization. The question is what kind? So how do you go about determining it? BIS provides this handy dandy little decision tree in the regulations in the EAR. And of course, the first question, which we've just discussed, is whether you are subject to the EAR. If your activity is subject to the ITAR, then you must follow the ITAR rules, not the EAR rules. So before you can figure out what to do, you have to check whether you are subject to the ITAR. And there'll be a webinar on that later in the week. Assuming that you're not subject to the ITAR or the nuclear regs, then you're subject to the EAR. You're sending something from the United States. Then you must determine the sensitivity of the item. That's the first question. And so you're checking to see whether the item is described in an export control classification number, an ECCN, on the Commerce Control List, the CCL, the Commerce Control List. If the item is described on the Commerce Control List, then it's subject to a higher level of controls. If it's not described on the Commerce Control List, and you've already made sure that it's not subject to the ITAR or the nuclear regs, then it will be called EAR 99. That's just a catch-all designation to tell you that something is subject to the EAR, but not very sensitive. Once you know whether something is described on the CCL or is EAR 99, then you take the next step to decide what kind of authorization will allow you to send it out of the country. And in both cases, you have to consider whether general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 would impose a license requirement. The general prohibitions, as the name suggests, are restrictions that apply to anything that is subject to the EAR. And 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 apply to certain end users, certain destinations, certain end uses. We're going to look through them in just a moment, but you have to figure out whether any of those apply. If none of those apply, then you move on to the next step. For items that are described on the Commerce Control List, that means figuring out whether the country you want to send them to imposes a license requirement. And then you figure out what kind of authorization you need. So we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail. So step number one, we're trying to figure out, is my item on the Commerce Control List or is it EAR 99? Because that will tell us how sensitive it is. The Commerce Control List is a very large list. If you printed it out, it would be about this thick, of items that are subject to the EAR. It tries to put them into basically 10 groups from categories from 0 to 9. They're large groups: marine, aerospace propulsion, electronics, computers. If you were trying to classify a laptop, you would look in the computer section. Trying to classify an iPhone, you would look in the electronics and computers section. If you were trying to classify a part for a commercial aircraft, you would look in category 9, aerospace and propulsion. You get the idea. Within each of those categories, there are groups describing different types of item. So if you're trying to classify technical information, you're going to look technical information related to maintenance of an aircraft, for example. You would look in category 9, aerospace, and you would look at the things that start 9E, E for technology. If you're trying to classify the aircraft itself, you would look in 9A, A for the end items. When you put these all together, you get export control classification numbers. Those are just paragraphs on the Commerce Control List, and they give you a series of characters like 0A982. That's the export control classification number for handcuffs. 9A004 is the export classification number for space launch vehicles. Okay, so you are looking at the list and you make a decision based on the type of item, which category you would find it in, and which group, and then you look at each paragraph in that category and group to see if your item is described there. I'll show you just a few examples. There are some very sensitive types of export control classification numbers. We refer to those as the 600 series and the 500 series because they have a 6 or a 5 as the third character. So 0A606, 606, 600 series, 0A501, 501, 501, 500 series. These are more sensitive because they used to be ITAR controlled, and they were moved out from the ITAR into the jurisdiction of the EAR because they're less sensitive. They don't warrant the extreme controls imposed on items under the ITAR, but they're still more sensitive than other things that are subject to the EAR, so they get special numbers. And when you see one of those numbers, you know that your item is subject to a higher level of control. So when you're thinking about technology, I already mentioned that would be technical information related to the design, development, production, maintenance, operation, use, etc., of a piece of controlled hardware. That's the kind of information that is controlled. Now let's look at a couple of ECCNs. We have here an example of an entry on the Commerce Control List. If you were looking to export a police baton, you would go and you would see that there's no category that really applies to it except for 0, which is the miscellaneous category. If you looked in category 0, you would find that 0A978 regulates police batons. And we're going to talk about what all the other things on this mean in a little while. But the important thing I wanted to point out here is that the only description of the items in this particular case is the description in the title, in the heading itself. There's no other information. It doesn't tell you how long a police baton needs to be, how strong it needs to be, what color it needs to be. Just all police batons are controlled and they are subject to this export control classification number. On the other hand, if you were thinking of exporting a valve, and you knew that the valve was made with stainless steel of some kind, it might be described in this ECCN 2A992. 2 and A for end items. And what's important here to see is when you scroll all the way down, you can see that in this case, unlike the previous entry where it was enough to know it was a police baton, in this case, not all valves are controlled. First, they have to be made of certain materials as described in the heading, stainless, copper, nickel alloy or other alloy steel, and it has to contain more than 10% of nickel or chromium. And when you get down here, it only applies if they satisfy the descriptions in subparagraph A or subparagraph B, which you can see are quite technical. They have to have a certain size, a pipe size connection of 200 nanometers. They have to be rated to a certain pressure. If they satisfy all of those, then they are captured by the ECCN. If they don't have all those characteristics, then you would have to look and see if any other ECCN captures them. And if no ECCN describes them, they would be EAR 99. There's another example that you can take a look at in a little while. So if you don't find your item described on the Commerce Control List, then the item is EAR 99, and that's the end of step 1. You have determined whether your item is on the Commerce Control List or EAR 99. So now you want to export it. What do you have to do next? Well, before we talk about that, let me just say that if you get confused trying to figure out the classification of your item, you can ask for help from the government. Now, you are encouraged to classify yourself. You're not required to go to the government and get a classification from them. You can make the determination I just described by yourself. That's perfectly lawful, and in fact, it's encouraged. But if you cannot make a decision, maybe there are multiple entries on the Commerce Control List that seem to describe your item, or maybe your customer is insisting that you have a formal determination from the US government because they want to be really sure that when they re-export the item from their foreign country to another foreign country, they don't get into trouble. Maybe they want you to get a formal classification. Those are known as CCATs, Commodity Classification Automated Tracking System Request. That's what that stands for. And you can submit a request through the online system SNAP-R, which stands for Simplified Network Application Process Redesign. It's an online tool, and you submit a request. You have to describe the item, you have to describe its technical capabilities, you have to upload specifications describing the technical capabilities of the item. BIS thinks about it, and then they will give you a classification determination. Very importantly, getting one of these it is not proof that the item is not subject to the ITAR. When BIS reviews these, they assume that it is not subject to the ITAR, but they do not determine that. The ITAR is more heavily regulated, and so you have to be certain that something is not subject to the ITAR before you submit a CCATS. A CCATS is not proof that it is not subject to the ITAR, but it will give you an ECCN under the EAR. I'm not going to talk in detail about how you go about applying for CCATS, but you can take a look at the additional information on that slide in your own time if that's something that's important for you to do. Again, that just gives you formal validation that the classification is correct. You're not required to seek a CCATS. It's an option for you if you want to be certain that you made the right decision about the classification. So we've looked at the commerce control list and we've determined that our item either is described there and now it has an ECCN, an export control classification number, or we've determined it's not described on the CCL and it is EAR 99. We still want to export it, so now we have to figure out whether the next step in all cases for an EAR 99 item, even for a jar of peanut butter or a stack of printer paper or a pair of earrings, those are all EAR 99 things. Even in that case, for the least sensitive items, I have to consider whether any of the general prohibitions 4 through 10 apply. So what are those general prohibitions? The EAR has 10 general prohibitions, a bit like the 10 Commandments. They set out certain things that you just can't do without permission from the US government. And some of them are to do with the parties that will be receiving the item. Some of them are to do with the way the party might want to use the item. And some of them are to do with other things. We're going to take a look through each of these general prohibitions that you have to consider. Before we do that, there's something that sometimes is important to know because the general prohibitions refer to country groups. When the general prohibitions refer to country groups, they're talking about the way that BIS organizes countries into groups that reflect how confident we feel about that country's ability to be responsible when receiving certain kinds of items. So for example, you can see on this page, country group A, there are actually 6 subgroups, A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if a country has an X in the box, it means it's a member of that group. A country can be a member of multiple different groups. And the EAR uses these groups to tell you when you can and can't send something in certain circumstances. So this is country group A. There's also country group D. You can see that country group D5, for example, are countries that we have a unilateral arms embargo against, such as Belarus and the Central African Republic. There are countries that we are a little worried about with respect to chemical and biological weapons. So those would be countries in country group D3. There would be an X in the box. Okay, so with that background, what are these general prohibitions that you have to check every time, even if all you want to do is export peanut butter? Well, general prohibitions 4 and 5, referred to in the trade as GP4 and GP5, they relate to restricted end users, parties receiving the items, and end uses, the way that those parties are going to use the items. So some parties are on lists. They have done something contrary to US national security, and they're placed on a list that restricts their ability to receive items that are subject to the EAR. And there are really 4 groups of lists: denial orders issued by the Commerce Department, sanctions targets. The Office of Foreign Asset Control adds people to a sanctions list. BIS reinforces that by saying those parties can't have items subject to the EAR. There are a couple of Commerce Department lists, the entity list and the unverified list. The important thing to know is that if a party is on that list, you probably can't export to them. That means before you export anything, you have to check the lists and see if a party is on any of those lists. Then there are some other types of end user and end use restrictions that relate to using these commercial dual use and less sensitive items for military applications. These are very complicated rules. They vary depending on the country where the party is located. And the definition of a military end user or end use also changes depending on the particular rule. But the point is that you have to do some due diligence into your recipient before you do an export, because if they are in China, for example, and if they satisfy the definition of a military end user, which is unfortunately not just the armed forces, but certain kinds of private companies who support military applications, then you would not be allowed to export to them items that are described in a certain supplement on the EAR. Not all items, but some. On the other hand, if they were a military end user in Russia, you would not be able to export any items to them at all that are subject to the EAR. So the first thing you have to do is due diligence into the recipient to make sure they're not on a list and they don't satisfy any of the several different definitions of military end user and end use in the EAR. Once you've done that, then there are some additional restrictions in General Prohibitions 4 and 5 that relate to the way the party might use the item. If you have knowledge that the party is going to use the item to develop a missile, which can include a long-range unmanned aerial vehicle, and that the party is in a country group D4, now you see why I described those country groups to you earlier, then you need a license before you can export that item. And you probably will have a difficult time getting such a license. Usually parties involved in these kinds of activities are disfavored. So let's say you want to export an item that is used for making unmanned aerial vehicles, and the party is in Israel, which is a country group D4 country, then you have to be assured that they are not going to engage in, they're not going to use it to build a missile, including a long-range unmanned aerial system. If they are, then you have to get a license from the Department of Commerce. So it's important to do that due diligence. This means you have to know the proposed end use. You have to know the end user and make sure they're not on a list and they're not a military end user. And you have to know the end use. What are they going to do with it? They're going to use it for missile-related activities. Are they going to use it to develop a supercomputer in China? That's another end-use restriction. Are they going to use it to put on an aircraft? In certain circumstances, you'll need additional information about that. So you check General Prohibitions 4 and 5. That's what it means to do that. Determine the end user, determine the end use, make sure they're not restricted. Once you've done that, you think about the countries. And certain countries are subject to a very high level of restrictions. These are the subject of General Prohibition 6. I'm not going to talk about these in detail, but you can see that certain items are restricted and require a license if they're going to either Cuba or Iran or North Korea or Syria, to the areas of Ukraine that have been occupied by Russia. What is interesting, and which I will talk about for a couple of seconds, are the Russia-Belarus restrictions. You've been reading in the newspaper that there's been a lot of restrictions imposed on Russia and Belarus. Some of those are imposed by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is a topic for a later webinar. But some are co-enforced by or imposed by the EAR. So for example, if you look over here in the left-hand corner, if you wanted to export any item that is described on the Commerce Control List to Russia or Belarus, you would need a license, and that license would be subject to a presumption of denial. This could apply to even very low-level items like copies of Microsoft Office software, which is described on the Commerce Control List. In addition, you can see at the bottom here, a license is required for luxury goods. Those goods are EAR 99 items. They're not described on the Commerce Control List, but they are restricted for export to Russia and Belarus. And the list of which EAR 99 items are restricted is given in supplement number 5 to this part of the EAR. In addition, there are several other supplements, supplements 4, 6, and 7, that describe more EAR 99 items that are restricted for Russia. So you can see that General Prohibition 6 imposes a large number of restrictions on what can be exported to Russia, including items on the CCL and EAR 99 items. So you check the end user, you check the end use. If you are exporting to any of these countries, or you think your recipient will transfer them to these countries, then you have to check that you are consistent with General Prohibition 6 as well. Tiring, right? It's a lot of work to export compliantly with the EAR. So you've checked the end user and end use. You've made sure none of those special destination restrictions apply. You also have to make sure that if a US person is involved in the activity, that they are not doing anything that would support one of these restricted applications. These are similar to the end use restrictions. They relate to missiles in certain countries, chemical and biological weapons, supercomputers in China and Macau. The difference is that for the end use restrictions, those apply when you are exporting something subject to the EAR. These US person restrictions apply even if the US person is not in the US, maybe they're living in Singapore, and they are not transferring anything that is subject to the EAR. They're just performing a service. Maybe they're going to build a website, for example. They would not be able to do that for a military intelligence end user in Belarus or Cambodia or China or Venezuela, as an example. So this is about the US person. If they have a blue passport, then it restricts their activities, even if they're not exporting anything subject to the EAR. So for foreign companies listening to this webinar, this is an important one to be aware of. All right, so you've checked general prohibitions 4 and 5, end use and end uses, 6 and 7, and you also have to think about the transit country in certain circumstances. So if you are exporting something from one country to another, sometimes it will have to go through certain other countries. And usually under the EAR, you only have to consider the destination. But for these countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Cambodia, Cuba, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Mongolia, North Korea, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam, if you are exporting something and it's going to go through those countries, then you also have to check whether it needs a license for that country. So perhaps it's going to Spain, and for Spain, you would not need a license. But because it's going through Belarus on the way to Spain, it does need a license. So when transiting these countries, additional restrictions apply. Okay. Finally, and we're still doing this even for an EAR 99 item, you have to consider whether there are any other restrictions that could apply. And one circumstance would be General Prohibition 10. If you are aware that the recipient may be planning to violate the EAR. Perhaps they are going to use it for an unauthorized permission. Perhaps they're going to re-export it to Cuba. Perhaps they're going to share it with a party that is subject to a denial order. Then you would have knowledge that a violation is going to occur, and you would be required not to do that transaction. If you went ahead, even with that knowledge, that would be a violation of General Prohibition 10. General Prohibition 10 prevents you from doing anything, taking any action with respect to an item where you know that a violation will occur. And knowledge includes reason to know. So any clue that should tell you that something bad is going to happen, you're expected to act on that information. You can't just pretend not to notice it. If you receive something that you're in a foreign country, you receive it, and the US party didn't have authorization, that's also a General Prohibition 10 problem. You're not allowed to do anything with that until you go to BIS and clean the problem up. So that's the first step. You determine whether it's on the CCL or EAR 99. Then in both cases, you have to check whether General Prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 impose a license requirement or a restriction on the export. Now, what if none of those general prohibitions apply? Then the next step, you only have to take for an item described on the CCL. In this case, you're looking to see whether the destination country requires a license, imposes a license requirement for the item. You do not have to do this for EAR 99. You only have to do it for items that are described on the Commerce Control List. So how would you do that? Let's say that you had determined that your item was controlled under ECCN 7A005. That's the export control classification number for your satellite navigation system. That's what you want to export. You would go to the ECCN and you would look and see what are the reasons for control. Every ECCN has different reasons for control. These reflect different policy decisions the government has made. So if I show you the next slide, and we'll come back to this one, you can see that there are 10 reasons for control. There are actually more than that, but they're defined by the number in the ECCN. National security is one, missile technology is another, anti-terrorism is another reason for control, crime control, which is really a human rights control, is another reason. So there are various different reasons for control. And if an item is controlled for national security, for example, it might need a license for all countries except Canada. It's a very high level of control. If something is controlled only for anti-terrorism, it only requires a license for certain countries that support terrorism. Those would be Iran, Syria, and North Korea, for example. So the reason for control is very important. It tells you whether the country that you want to export to is associated with a license requirement for the item. And the way you figure that out is you go to the ECCN and you write down each of the reasons for control indicated in the big box at the top of the ECCN. There are two things you have to write down. One is the reason for control, indicated by a 2-letter reference, NS for national security, MT for missile technology, AT for anti-terrorism, and the column on something called the country chart, which we're going to look at in a moment. So in this case, 7A005.B items are controlled for national security column 1, MT column 1, and AT column 1. So what do you do with that information? You write it on your little yellow sticky, and then you have to go and look at the commerce country chart. This is what it looks like. And you can see that the reasons for control are across the top, the countries are down the side. If there is an X in the box, that means that there is a license requirement for that reason for control to that country. So if we look here, for example, we can see that for Afghanistan, a whole bunch of different reasons for control impose a license requirement. Chemical and biological 1, chemical and biological 2, 3, nuclear non-proliferation 1, etc. So you look to see if there's an X in the box, and that will tell you if there's a license requirement for that reason for control for that country. You're going to have to do this for each potential reason for control. Let's do a little practice here. So we're going back to 7A005. Let's figure out if they need a license for Angola. You look at the reasons for control and you write them down. And in this case, it's NS column 1, MT column 1, and AT, right? That's what the box at the top of the ECCN says. And then you go to the commerce country chart. There's an excerpt on this slide. You find each reason for control and you circle it. And then you go down to the country and you see if there's an X in the box. So for Angola, national security column 1 imposes a license requirement. Missile technology also imposes a license requirement, but anti-terrorism does not. Now this tells you that to export a 7A005 item to Angola, even if the end user is okay, the end use is okay, there's no general prohibition 10 problem, none of general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 impose a license requirement. Even if that's true, the country imposes a license requirement based on these reasons for control. And there are 2 of them. That tells me that my license will take a little longer and it may be denied. The more reasons for control there are imposing a license requirement, the slower the license will be, the less likely it is that you will get the license, the more conditions that there will be. And that's why it's important to check each reason for control. You don't just stop when you find one. Okay, on the other hand, Canada, there are no license requirements imposed by any of these reasons for control. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just put it in a box and send it. You have to have checked, as we did just a moment ago, general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, to make sure that the recipient in Canada is allowed, that the end use the Canadian person intends to use the item for is allowed. But you also have to check, if it's on the CCL, whether the country itself is associated with the license requirement, and this is how you do that. Okay, let's have a look at another example. Imagine you wanted to export these fluffy pink handcuffs somewhere. You would go to the Commerce Control List, you would look to see if they're on the list, and you would find, maybe surprisingly, that law enforcement restraint devices, including handcuffs, are described in 0A982. Now, maybe these particular handcuffs are not law enforcement restraint devices. You can see that there's a note that says that this ECCN does not apply to medical restraints, for example. Maybe it doesn't apply to these either. You'd have to do some analysis to figure out whether these are, in fact, law enforcement restraint devices that have been covered with something fluffy and pink, or maybe they are just not law enforcement restraint devices. They're not strong enough, they couldn't be used by the police. If, though, they are described in 0A982, then you would see that in this case it says reason for control, crime control. Now, this is different from the slide we looked at a moment ago because there's no box at the top. There's no box that says this, like this one. So in this case, we don't look at the Commerce Country Chart. We look at the text in the ECCN, and it tells us that a license is required for all destinations. Okay, so that is how you figure out whether you need authorization for your export. What steps did we take? Again, the first thing we did was we checked to see whether our item was subject to the EAR, which means you have to be sure that it's not subject to the ITAR and not subject to the nuclear-related regulations. So you've done that work. Now you've determined that you are in the land of the EAR. You have to comply with EAR rules. The next step, you check whether the item is described on the Commerce Control List or whether it is EAR 99. The EAR 99 if it is not described on the Commerce Control List. In both cases, before you can export it, you have to make sure that none of general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 impose a license requirement. That is, you have to do due diligence on the end user, make sure they're not on a list, they don't present a military end user problem. You also have to check whether the end use is okay. It's not related to missiles, nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons, supercomputing in China or Macau, certain other kinds of semiconductor related activities in China or Macau. You make sure none of those restrictions apply. If they do, you're going to need a license. If they don't, then you move on and you consider whether any of the other general prohibitions, 7, 8, 9, and 10, impose a license requirement. If they don't, then the next thing you do is to check the Commerce Country Chart and see whether the ECCN for your item and the reasons for control associated with that ECCN impose a license requirement for the destination country. That's what we just did. Now, let's say that you get to the end of that process and you determine there's no problem with my end user, there's no problem with my end use, none of that imposes a license requirement, but my ECCN is controlled for national security, column 1, and it requires a license for all countries except Canada, and I want to export to Germany. Germany isn't Canada, so I know I need a license. What do I do? Well, you have two choices. You might be able to use a license exception, which is a type of pre-published license, or you might be able to use a license, apply for a license from BIS. In each case, the first thing you do is check whether a license exception is available. A license exception is good because you don't have to apply in advance, so it will be faster. So that's why we always check those first. If there is no license exception, then you apply for a license. In both cases, there will be terms and conditions that you will have to comply with in order to use that as the authorization for export. And in both cases, you will have to keep records of what you exported, who you exported it to, what authorization you used for at least 5 years after the export. So what's a license exception? It's a confusing name because it sounds like an exception to the need for a license, but that's not true. You still need authorization, and the license exception is the authorization. It's actually a type of license. The difference from a license is that the license exception is published in advance. It's in the regulations with the terms and conditions, so you don't have to apply to BIS for approval. So it's really just an exception to the need to apply. It's not an exception to the need to have authorization. When you use a license exception, you're certifying to the government that you have checked the terms and conditions and that your transaction complies with all of them. That's a serious business. You have to be sure that it's true. So you have to read them very carefully and make sure that you satisfy all the terms and conditions. And then you have to keep records demonstrating that you were entitled to use the license exception. That's a topic for another webinar later in the week, so we're not going to talk about what all these license exceptions mean, but just remember that they are a pre-published license, they apply in certain circumstances, they have terms and conditions that have to be satisfied. If none of the license exceptions apply to your particular situation, perhaps they don't cover the ECCN for the item that you want to export, or perhaps they're not available for the country that you want to export to, or perhaps they're not available for the end use that your recipient wants to use them for, then you have to apply for a license. So EAR export licenses are a very strange kind of creature. It's a little bit like a driving license that tells you, well, you can drive from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a red car, and you must turn left. It's very limited, very specific. It's not a general authorization to do whatever you want. So you apply for an export license. They are limited in time. You can only use them for 4 years. So you get one, it's valid for 4 years. After that, it's gone. You can't continue to export. It's also limited by the items. You only can export exactly what you told BIS you planned to export. If the capabilities of the item changes, you develop a new version with additional capabilities, that's not covered by the license. Only the version that you described when you applied for the license is covered. You also have to tell BIS how many items you plan to export and how much they're worth. You have to give the quantity and the value. And as you export items, you use up the quantity and value. And if you export everything, all the quantity and all the value in the first year, then the license expires, even though there are still 3 years left. So they expire either when the time expires or when you have exported the total quantity or the total value that you told BIS about, whichever one comes first. This means you have to track it. So if I get a license to export 10 widgets and I export 5 of them on Monday, I need to make a note that I only have 5 left. And if I wait 2 years and then I export the remaining 5, then my license is used up and I have to go and get a new one. I can't continue to use it. EAR licenses are also restricted to the parties that you list. You have to tell BIS who the recipient is. That could be the end user, the party that's going to use it. But sometimes you export something to an intermediary, maybe to a party that is going to take that item and assemble it into something else, and then they're going to pass it on to the final end user. That party in the middle is an intermediate consignee, and they have to be identified as well. BIS needs to know all the babysitters that are going to look after this precious EAR item that you are asking for permission to export. So you have to identify each party, the name, the address, it all has to be accurate. And sometimes if something changes, you will have to get a new license. For example, if the name of the party changes, license isn't valid anymore because that's not the party that you described to BIS. Finally, licenses are restricted by the end use. You have to tell BIS what the receiving party is going to do with the item. And if they're going to take it and use it to build a nuclear bomb, that is not okay. You won't get a license for that. If they're going to, and so you have to tell BIS so the BIS knows that they're not going to use it for a nuclear bomb, for example. So you have to describe the end use and you have to describe it in some degree of specificity. This means you have to ask your party, your customer, what they're going to do with the item so that you can tell BIS so that you can get a license. As we saw before, you also need to know the end use so that you can check that none of the general prohibitions prohibit you from doing the export. All right, so applying for a license, you need quite a lot of information. It takes some planning to do. As I said, you have to explain what you're exporting, give the ECCN, describe the item, describe the end use, identify all the parties, including freight forwarders who are going to be involved, and so on, and the countries where the item is going to be exported to. The way you apply for a license is online in the electronic system. You can use the system SnapR. You have to use the SnapR system. And you do it using a form called the BIS 748P. That's just the reference to the form that you use for applying for a license. In order to use SnapR, you have to apply for a company identification number, and you have to have an active account. You don't have to pay for that. There's no fee. And there's no fee to apply for a license either. So how do you get a SnapR account so that you can apply for a license? You go to the Bureau of Industry and Security website. There's lots of useful information on here, including many in the compliance and training. There are many webinars that BIS has created that you can watch. But if you're trying to register for SnapR to apply for a license, you go to the licensing tab. There is a drop-down menu. It includes an option for SnapR. And then there is an option for registering to log into SnapR. You click on that, and it takes you to a page where you can either log in or register for a SnapR account. Once the company has done that, then the company is able to submit license applications and also the CCATs, which I mentioned earlier, the commodity classification request. You also need a SnapR account to submit that. Okay, so what have we done? We have determined that we're subject to the EAR. I want to export something, or maybe I'm a foreign company. I received it from the US and I want to re-export it to another foreign country, transfer it from France to Germany, for example. Or I received it to use it for one purpose, and now I want to change it and use it for a different purpose. That's also a regulated activity. So I knew I was subject to the EAR and that I needed to comply with the EAR rules. Then I said, okay, now I need to know if it's EAR 99 or if it's on the Commerce Control List. So I checked the list, determined whether it had an export control classification number. Once I'd done that, I checked whether my export would trigger any of General Prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. Whether the end user was all right, whether the end use was all right, whether there were any other restrictions on the export. After I determined that there were no problems with the general prohibitions, I knew I had an ECCN, so I went and I checked the Commerce Country Chart to see whether my ECCN requires a license for that country, the country where my customer is located. And after I did that, I realized that I needed a license, or maybe I don't need a license. Now I actually have to do the export. And whether you are needing a license or not needing a license, there are certain requirements that you have to comply with in the shipping process in order to demonstrate that you've complied with the EAR. So what are they? If you don't need a license, if you get through this process in the decision tree and you get to the box that says no license required, meaning general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 do not apply, and either it's EAR 99 or the Commerce Country Chart did not have an X in the box for the reason for control in your country, then you're in the territory of no license required. This is a type of authorization. It's confusing, it's a funny name, no license required, but it is itself a type of authorization that you are using. And when you use it, you have to satisfy with certain conditions. You can only use it if the item is EAR 99 and general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 do not apply, or the item is on the Commerce Control List, it has an export classification number, but the reasons for control don't impose a license requirement, and general prohibitions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 do not apply. If you are in that happy situation, then the authority for you to put that jar of peanut butter in the box and send it to your grandma in Turkey is no license required. So what do you have to do? Even when you're exporting no license required, you may have to file electronic export information. For those of you who are calling in from overseas, this requirement only applies to US exporters, parties exporting from the United States. If you are exporting from the United States, then you have to tell the US government when you make an export, with certain exceptions. And you do that through an electronic system that is actually run by Customs and Border Protection. It's called the ACE system, ACE. There's an ACE portal. So even when you're shipping no license required, you may have to file electronic export information. And you have to do that when the value under any single HTS code is over $2,500, or when you're exporting certain sensitive items, items in the 600 series, for example, or when you're exporting to certain sensitive countries. And there are some other situations as well, which I didn't have room to describe on the slide, but you can see those described in 15 CFR 758.1. So the point is that you get all the way through, you determine, yay, no license required, but you still have some obligations. You have to see whether you need to file electronic export information. This is something you can arrange for your freight forwarder like FedEx to do for you. But even when they do it for you, you are responsible and you need to make sure that they did it correctly. If they did it incorrectly, you may have an EAR violation. You may also have penalties from the Customs and Border Protection for failing to file accurate EEI. Okay, now, if you're not exporting, if you are exporting no license required, you check whether EEI is required and you make a record. This is what I exported, this is who I exported it to, and you keep it for 5 years from the time of export. If you're exporting under a license or a license exception, then you also need to keep a record of the license, the application for the license showing what you applied for, or a copy of the license exception as of the date, because things change over time. You want to have a copy that shows what it looked like on the date that you exported. And you have to keep those for 5 years from the export for a license exception, or for 5 years from the expiration of the license if you're exporting under a license. That could be 9 years. Licenses live for 4 years. You export under the license on day one, you have to keep the record for the period of the license and then 5 more years. And what records do you have to keep? Proof of, you have to keep a copy of the license or the license exception, as I said, but also the commercial invoice to prove what you exported and who you exported it to, the shipping documents for the same reading. There might be a bill of lading that you need to preserve, or it could be an airway bill if you exported it by aircraft. In addition, you have to warn the recipient that they are getting something that is subject to US law, and that they will have their own obligations under the EAR after they receive it. The way we do that is to include a destination control statement. This is not a best practice, it's a legal requirement. You must include it on the commercial invoice, and it has to follow the wording in the EAR, which explains that the items are controlled by the US government and can only be exported to certain destinations. Now, if your item is EAR 99 and you're exporting no license required, you don't have to include a destination control statement, but it is a best practice to do so. If you put yourself in the position of the foreign recipient, they need to know that this item comes with strings attached, that anything they do with it afterwards has to comply with the EAR. So it's only polite to warn them about that. All right, we're now at the end of the presentation, and so I will be happy to take any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Tahlia. Wow, fantastic overview. You are fantastic. I just want to thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and experience as well. We do have some questions. We'll open it up. We'll try to answer as many as we can. And Tahlia, just question, can you see the Q&A?
I can't see it right now, but maybe if I
Okay.
change the layout, I'll be able to see it.
So one that came in, and I'll do my best to read these off, and we'll see what we can cover and what we can't. Let me go here. So when a shipment is imported into the U.S., but after examination by customs, it is determined that it is not allowed to be imported, will the importer be able to export it to a country other than the original exporting country? Would the export regulations have to be reviewed if it has not officially entered commerce?
Yes.
Okay.
So entering the US for customs purposes is not quite the same as entering for export purposes. So the export obligations will attach as soon as it enters US territory, even if it is still not technically in the customs territory of the United States. So if it's stuck at the border, you want to send it back, it's still an export from the US. You still have to comply with the export regulations. The two don't join exactly neatly, the import controls and the export controls. But if it's landed in the US and it needs to go back, you have to comply with the export regulations.
Okay.